Mesh menu has 3 sub-menu items: Extrude to Surface Primitive, Surface Mesh, and XYZ Plane. These items are to generate volume meshes, by extruding source surface meshes up to the bounding object, that is, surface primitive, surface mesh, and XYZ plane, as shown on the screen. Let's first examine the case of extrusion to surface primitives. A sphere is exemplified as the bounding surface primitive. Choose the sub-menu item, Extrude to Surface Primitive, from Mesh menu. Then, Extrude to Primitive dialog opens. Set the element type to hexahedron. Extruding direction to X. Bounding side to near, which implies that the extrusion is bounded by the near side of the sphere. Number of divisions to 6. And select the surface mesh. Set Source Surface button is enabled. Click the button. Then, the caption of the button is changed to Set Bounding Primitive, and the button is disabled. Select the sphere by clicking it. The bounding primitive is represented in red color. Set Bounding Primitive is enabled. Click the button. Then, the volume mesh is generated. Undo the mesh generation. For next trial of FAR option for the bounding side, click FAR radio button. The FAR option lengthens the extrusion distance. So, increase the number of divisions to 16. Select the surface mesh, and click Set Source Surface button. Select the sphere, and click Set Bounding Primitive. The newly generated volume mesh is bounded by the far side of the sphere. Undo the mesh generation, and try the case of extrusion in normal direction. Set the option of the bounding side to near, and the number of divisions to 6. Select and set the surface mesh. And select the bounding primitive, and click Set Bounding Primitive button. But mesh is not generated. Instead, there appears the message, the bounding primitive cannot cover the extrusion range. Let's close Extrude to Primitive dialog and examine the reason why the mesh generation failed. The front view clearly shows that the normal line from the part of the surface mesh cannot be covered by the bounding primitive. Let's modify the sphere to create an example working for extrusion in normal direction. Press the Primitive Modification tool. Now, we can either move the center of the sphere or change its radius. Let's change the radius of the sphere to 20. The surface mesh is completely enclosed by the sphere. Choose Extrude to Surface Primitive sub-menu item again. Keep the last option set of normal direction and near bounding side. Select the surface mesh and the bounding primitive. Click Set Bounding Primitive button. The volume mesh is successfully generated, this time. Undo the mesh generation, and try FAR option. Click FAR radio button of Bounding Side option. Change the number of divisions to 16. The division weight to 1 versus 4. Select and set the surface mesh and the bounding primitive. And generate the mesh again. New volume mesh is bounded by the far side of the sphere. Delete the sphere, because we do not need this sphere any longer. The next example is the case of volume mesh generation, by extrusion to the bounding surface mesh. As shown on the screen, the source and bounding surface meshes are prepared in advance for this example. Choose Extrude to Surface Mesh sub-menu item from Mesh menu. Extrude to Mesh dialog opens. Set the element type to hexahedron. Set the extruding direction to X and change the number of divisions to 10. Uncheck Delete Bounding Mesh item, so that the bounding surface mesh is not automatically deleted after mesh generation. Select the surface mesh, and click Set Source Surface button. And select the bounding surface mesh, and click Set Bounding Surface button. The volume mesh is generated. However, the bounding surface mesh is still maintained, although the bounding surface mesh is not necessary any longer after the mesh generation. It is the result of unchecking Delete Bounding Mesh option. So, select the bounding surface mesh, and delete it. Deleting a surface mesh does not automatically delete the curves belong to the mesh. Therefore, there still remain the boundary curves of the deleted surface mesh. Click the Curve Selection tool, and select the curves by rubber banding. Press Delete key. There appears a message, the meshed curves could not be deleted. Ignore the message, because it is a notice that curves belonging to the existing surface meshes are not affected. All the unnecessary mesh and curves are removed, and there remains only the newly generated volume mesh. The last example is the case of volume mesh generation, by extrusion to a grid plane. Choose Extrude to XYZ plane, sub-menu item from Mesh menu. Extrude to XYZ plane dialog opens. Set the element type, extruding direction, and bounding plane. The normal extruding direction can be used, in combination with, any one of XY, YZ and ZX plane. When the bounding plane is chosen, the corresponding grid plane is displayed on the screen. The extruding directions except normal direction, that is, X, Y, and Z directions are associated with YZ, ZX and XY grid planes respectively. For example, clicking X radio button of extruding direction automatically turns on YZ radio button of bounding plane option. Y radio button turns on ZX radio button. On the other hand, clicking XY radio button selects Z radio button of extruding direction. Let's select X direction. Accordingly, YZ grid plane is on. Position of YZ plane is determined by X elevation. Inputting the elevation value moves the YZ grid plane. As a test, change the value from 0 to 5. Then, YZ plane moves 5 units forward. Set the X elevation to 20. The grid plane moves forward, beyond the surface mesh. Rotate the view using the virtual trackball, to reveal the space between the surface mesh and grid plane. Set the number of divisions to 16, for appropriate volume mesh generation. Select the surface mesh, and click Set Source Surface button. Then, the volume mesh is generated by extrusion to YZ plane. Undo the mesh generation, and try extrusion in normal direction. The elevation value can also be set by directly moving the corresponding grid plane. Press the Grid Movement tool, and drag the grid plane. The elevation value changes in accordance with the grid movement. Set the X elevation to 14, and change the extruding direction to normal. Set the number of divisions to 10. Select the source surface mesh, and click Set Source Surface button. The volume mesh is generated. The display shows that the newly generated mesh is bounded by YZ plane. This is the end of the tutorial for Extrude to Bounding Object Mesh Generation.